This is David Marshall on Wind of the Tao podcast, where the wind blows where it wills and no one knows quite what's coming next. This is my fifth broadcast on this channel. Up till now, I've welcomed 4 guests in 4 years. Biologist Michael Behe, scholar of religions Win Corduan, poet and literary scholar Anthony Esselin, and philosopher and education reformer Corey Miller. That's quite a mixed bag, you might say. What's this podcast really about? I don't see a clear pattern so far. Are you too antsy to settle down, focus on one subject? Well, maybe. Last year of high school, I remember running between Russian class under Mrs. Morton and journalism class, where I published articles about how oxygen causes cancer and interviews with football stars and photos of bees on crocuses in the school newspaper. But you probably noticed a pattern here. All of my interview subjects have been Christians, as I am myself. A peripatetic perspective is reflected in the title of this podcast, The Wind of the Tao. Jesus said, the wind blows where it will. The idea is that the seeker of truth is not limited by the boundaries of a single discipline. He can poke his nose under any rock, climb every mountain of fact, ford every stream of logic, follow every rainbow. Or to explain it as philosopher Isaiah Berlin put it, he can be more of a fox than a hedgehog, wandering into many fields instead of burrowing forever in one spot. Or as the ancient Chinese philosopher, who we're going to be talking about today a little bit, Confucius said, a gentleman is no tool. So, wind of the Tao. What is the Tao? Isn't that a pagan concept? You said this is a Christian podcast. Some new age, Jungian nonsense about archetypes and synchronicity? Or else religious appropriation? Are you robbing an ancient Chinese concept from the people who invented it to push some sort of Western religion? And that brings up a bigger question. How do religions fit together? Is it my way or the highway? Exclusivism? The idea that there's one true faith and everything else is just completely false? Or is it pluralistic perspective where there are many paths going up the same mountain? John Hick called it the real. In other words, each religion is like a planet circling the sun. Jupiter, Mars, Saturn. Each religion reflects the glow of the ultimate truth, whether you call that the real or the Tao, the ultimate, the universe, or God. Those are the 2 options you hear the most about, exclusivism or pluralism. How do religions fit together? We're going to talk about that a little bit today in the next few weeks. When I'm here by myself, I'll probably just be talking for 20 or 30 minutes or so. When I have a guest, we'll probably be going for more than an hour most of the time. This week and the next few weeks, I'm going to talk about the Tao or the Tao. Now, what's the difference? Why is it sometimes spelled with the T and sometimes with the D? The T is the old Wade-Giles phoneticization. D is the modern Chinese pinyin. It's how the word is usually pronounced in modern Mandarin Chinese. So what is the Tao? Lao Zi, the alleged author of the Tao Te Ching, what were his main ideas? Why do so many people seem to love the Tao Te Ching? In fact, the Tao Te Ching has been translated dozens of times into English and into other European languages and also into East Asian languages many, many times, probably hundreds of times altogether. One reason it's translated so many times is because it's short. You can read it in about 2 hours in one of the English translations, but it's also very pithy, I would say, and enigmatic. The Tao Te Ching is not an easy book to translate. In some ways, it's an easy book to translate. In some ways, it's a very difficult book to translate. Because the words themselves are simple, but their meaning is sometimes obscure. And so that's one reason we need to understand a little bit more what the Tao means in order to understand, first of all, why I'm doing this podcast and what I mean by it. And secondly, how Christianity relates to Taoism. Then next week, I'm going to talk about the way of Lao Zi and the way of Jesus. Beginning of the Gospel of John is translated, 太初有道，道与神同在，道就是神. In the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. 道成肉身，住在我们中间，充充满满有恩典有真理. The Word, the Tao, became flesh and dwelled among us, full of grace and truth. And in fact, that's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation about. This logos of the Bible, of John, and the Tao of Lao Zi. Is that, on the one hand, evidence of God in China? Or on the other hand, is Taoism sort of New Age pantheism? I'm going to give you some of my juiciest findings on that subject next week. Let's talk first of all about this word Tao and what it actually means. If you want to understand Taoism, you have to understand that the term Tao did not originate from the Tao Te Ching itself. The Tao Te Ching was a book written by Lao Zi about 300 or 400 BC. Some people say earlier than that. But even half a millennia before that, the concept of the Tao was also very firmly rooted in Chinese culture. So, what is the Tao or the Tao? Well, here's a quote from a modern Taoist. Taoism is not just a religion, it's a way of life. Way, notice the word way is a translation of Tao, by the way. Taoism, or Taoism, is about living in harmony with the Tao, the natural flow of the universe. It's not about rules or dogma, it's about balance, simplicity, peace within. Those are actually rules, and they are based on certain dogmas. The Tao originally, however, meant path or route or road. The term originated, as far as we can tell, from the earliest Chinese writings in the Shang Dynasty about 3,000 years ago. And that basic meaning of Tao still holds in modern Chinese. So, what is Taoism? The original term Tao first appears in the oracle bones of the Shang Dynasty, and in very early writing it looks something like this. Those two marks on the left and the two on the right, you can see they're kind of symmetrical. Together they mean to go or to travel. In modern Chinese, they still use that xing. And the middle means shou, one of the modern Chinese words for head. So the Tao meant to travel purposefully. It meant to lead, to move intentionally, to lead forward. The oldest text in China, aside from the I Ching, which is kind of enigmatic, and most of the I Ching is actually much later commentary on the I Ching. The oldest texts are the Book of History and the Book of Poetry. Those are books that are often quoted by Confucius as Old Testament. In the Book of Poetry, the Tao is usually used concretely as a road, a path, a route. In the Book of History, however, it has that meaning, and it is also associated with heaven and divinely appointed rule. So to understand Taoism, we have to go back several hundred years and see what it meant to Lao Zi himself and to the people around him. So we begin with the Book of Poetry and the Book of History. In the Book of Poetry, Tao could sometimes mean speak, secondary meaning of Tao, but it also meant a physical path. The path, here I'm quoting, the path to royal cities symbolizes the depressed state of the nation in the Book of Poetry 149. The route to the capital is easy and plain, Book of Poetry 105. Winding and slow, 162, or overgrown with weeds, 197. Okay, that's fairly concrete. Then in the Book of History, rivers are routes, Tao, along which tribute flows to the Xia and Zhou dynasties from border tribes. And that already starts to mix in the idea of the mandate of heaven, Tianming. So the Tao is not only a route, but it also reflects the rule of heaven. And therefore the Xia and the Shang dynasties, the Zhou dynasties receive tribute from border tribes because of the mandate of heaven. It means the royal way. Tao is also translated as principles of reason by the great Victorian translator James Legge. Tao was the path prescribed by heaven. Now here's a very important combination of terms, Tian Tao. Tian means heaven, Tao means the path. One in accord with that Tao listens to both living ministers and the ancients, so that all truth, Tao again, accumulates in his person. So now it has a meaning beyond just a path or a route. Human ways were not always virtuous, but the Tao of heaven, Tian Tao, is inherently good. So, most often in the Book of History, Tao refers to right action and carries divine connotations, kind of like wisdom in Proverbs 9. Okay, now we're moving forward several hundred years to the great philosopher Confucius. Confucius quoted the Book of History and the Book of Poetry, as I said, and he used the word Tao to refer to transcendent moral truth. A little bit different emphasis here. The ultimate principles behind the universe, or a model of life exemplified by holy sages. one's proper course, the way of the ancients, principle, guiding a state. Should one hear of the way in the morning, yet die that evening, one may be satisfied with one's life, according to the Analects 4:8, which is the primary source for Confucius's thinking. Still, Confucius did not talk about the way of heaven, 5:13. One must be ashamed of a scholar, he said, who worries about food and clothing more than the right way. So this is transcendent. This is something more important than anything else already to Confucius. The civilized world had long been shorn of, here's another translation, true principles, which determine the state of the nation. All this rich spiritual meaning had already been established long before Taoism appeared. Now, traditionally, people thought that Lao Zi was an older contemporary of Confucius, but modern scholarship sees him as a little bit later than Confucius. And both the ancient classics and Confucius, this is kind of a controversial thing to say, they were theists. They believed in a supreme God and spoke of his way, the Tian Dao, the way of heaven. Sometimes I think even the term Shangdi Dao, the way of Shangdi, or God, was also, I think, used. But the two terms were very closely associated in the book of poetry especially, and also in the book of history. So like John's Logos then, Lao Tzu's adoption of the word Tao involves kind of a conceptual leap, as we'll see, but only down a fairly well-trod path. There is not a sharp discontinuity between the ancients and Lao Tzu. And anyone tries to take Lao Tzu out of his context of ancient Chinese thought is thinking anachronistically. Now notice the way that Confucius used the word having to do with absolute moral truth, the ultimate moral principles of the universe, is very close to the way that C.S. Lewis used the term in his great book on universal morality, The Abolition of Man. In fact, C.S. Lewis borrowed this term from Confucius. He had not read the Tao Te Ching or Zhuangzi. Confucius, translated by Arthur Whaley, was pretty much the only picture of ancient Chinese thought that he'd ever encountered directly. A lot of the things I'm talking about today are from my doctoral dissertation, Fulfillment, a Christian Model of Religions, and also from my popular book, True Son of Heaven, How Jesus Fulfills the Chinese Culture. Now, Taoism is also called Lao Zhuang thought in modern Chinese. Taoism is really two different things. Taoism, first of all, is a philosophy based on the thought of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. And secondly, it is a religion that arose from that thought, but looks very, very different from the original. I'm going to be concentrating not on the religion, but on the philosophy today. And I'm looking mostly at Lao Tzu, but I may mention Zhuangzi once or twice as well. A couple more notes before we get started on the text itself. Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, you may have noticed a common root in both of their names, Zi. Confucius' name in Chinese is also Kongzi, and his famous disciple is Mengzi. So you may be wondering what the Zi means. In modern Chinese, it means son or child. It has other meanings as well. But in ancient Chinese, it could be translated as master in both of its modern English senses. Professor Boltz explained. Master in the sense of young Master Blake, and also master in the sense of Lord or great teacher. In these two images, you see two pictures typical of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Lao Tzu, after he wrote the Tao Te Ching, this 81 chapter, you can read it in 2 hours. After he wrote this very enigmatic, epigrammic book, got on his oxen and he rode off into the West. The very famous story about Lao Tzu. Famous story by Zhuangzi, because Zhuangzi is more of a teller of parables. He's one of the great storytellers of ancient China. He says that one day he dreamed that he was a butterfly. Then he woke up and he said, hey, am I a man who had a dream about being a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming that I was a man? As I said, you can read the Tao Te Ching in about 2 hours. I recommend perhaps Vincent Lau or Lin Yutang, Lin Yutang was one of the great writers of 20th century China. Another version of the Tao Te Ching you can find online is James Legg's translation at the China Text Projects. Legg's translation is very reliable, but rather stiff and prosaic. It doesn't quite catch the poetic style of the original very well. Avoid Stephen Mitchell's so-called translation of the Tao Te Ching like the plague. It's very, very popular. Sold, I think, probably, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of copies. Mitchell didn't even know Chinese, and he's basically projecting his own modern American ideas on the text. The Tao Te Ching focuses on three main concepts. First is the Tao, which we'll talk about. The second is De, which means virtue or spiritual power, as a manifestation of the Tao. And then the third very important concept we'll mention a little bit about today is Sheng, or sage. The sage represents the Tao on earth. It's also a revelation of the divine. In original ancient Chinese thinking, the sage was supposed to be a ruler. In fact, the sage is someone who creates something very important. He's a creator, he's an inventor, especially an inventor of a dynasty. But then one of the followers of Confucius, Mengzi, had an idea, and he said, hey, you know who the greatest sage is? The greatest sage was actually my teacher, Confucius. So the concept of sage was changing in later China, but at the time the Tao Te Ching was written, sage usually referred to somebody who was a king, was a ruler of some kind who benefited everyone under heaven. So let's look at 10 key quotes from the Tao Te Ching, and then next week we'll talk about what they have to do with Christianity. I'll mention a little bit about that today already. The first, and perhaps most famous saying in the Tao Te Ching, is Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, Ming ke Ming, Fei Chang Ming. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. This is sort of a pun. This first phrase, Dao ke Dao, the Tao that can be Taoed. The first Tao means the way, and the second Tao means spoken. So it's kind of like the way that can be weighed, like an anchor, is not the true way. In other words, ultimate truth is beyond the power of words to express. That name which lies beyond time cannot be fully conceptualized. Sometimes, Forrest Gump observed, there just aren't enough rocks. Sometimes there aren't enough words. Now, this picture of the Tao is very important in Chinese history and very influential in Chinese religion. For example, here I am climbing Mount Tai in Shandong province. Mount Tai was one of 5 sacred peaks in ancient China. It was the eastern peak because the 5 ancient peaks corresponded to the 5 directions, including central. The eastern peak, or Mount Tai, about 5,000 feet high, not all that tall. At the very top of it, you'll find this monument. And what is written on the rock monument? Nothing. Therefore, it's called the monument without words. This also expresses the concept of the Tao Te Ching, of speaking without words. Sometimes you can't really express what's inside your heart. You intuit it without being able to speak it out. Even at Peking University, where I was teaching over the last year and a half, you have the lake without a name. Buddhism gave birth to a uniquely Chinese form of Buddhism, which is called Zen or Chan. Zen is in some ways more similar to the Tao and relies more on Taoist thinking, Lao Zhuang thinking, than it does on original Buddhism in India. So why is silence so important part of Zen Buddhism? What is the sound of one hand clapping? How do you come to supreme enlightenment? Through unspoken riddles. Although Zen Buddhism probably draws more on Zhuangzi than it does on Lao Zi, this is probably part of what it drew from Lao Zi. The second saying I want to introduce is chapter 3, without acting. The Tao Te Ching is very paradoxical. Act without acting, or striving, in other words, and rule all. Wow. This is a profound saying, and not only paradoxical, but maybe ridiculous for people like Alexander the Great. You don't win by sitting on your butt. You get out on your horse, you're still sitting on your butt, but you get off your horse sometimes and you conquer the world. You don't see this concept so clearly in Western culture. What does it mean? It means don't force it. The Tao Te Ching originally was written, remember, to a ruler. There are hints of this idea of ruling through kindness or gentleness in older scriptures in the Book of History, but also you find admonitions to cut off ears and other body parts when citizens misbehave. A king should not grasp power, but refuse it until his ministers all come to him and say, please sit on the throne, we need you, the nation needs you. Was that a polite fiction? Yeah, usually. But in chapter 3, we find a concept, an ideal that is very different from the Western concept. Although, to be fair, in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, we do have a situation in which Julius Caesar is offered the crown 3 times and 3 times did refuse it. Yeah, so polite fiction in both civilizations. The paradox expressed in this verse only really comes to life in the West through the suffering servant, the rejected king who washed the feet of his disciples and conquered the world. How? By dying of torture, rejected and disgraced before the nation. Chapter 5, however, paints a very different picture of the Tao, one we must take into account as we try to understand this book. Heaven and earth are unkind and treat all things as straw dogs. Now, what does that mean? In ancient China, the ruler would eventually pass away, even though the Chinese would say 10,000 years to the king. Eventually, they would die, usually a long time before that. So what would you do? You'd put him in an enormous tomb, and then you would sacrifice animals and human beings to send him off to the other world and to serve him in the other world. Horses, camels sometimes, even elephants, human beings for sure, and dogs. Now, if you weren't rich enough to have that kind of a send-off, you would have to make do, perhaps by making a straw dog. The straw dog, therefore, is a very expendable creature. Chapter 5 is the skeptic's chapter. It's the cynic's chapter. Some scholars interpret the entire Tao Te Ching from this one passage. The Tao is an impersonal, natural process. It does not care for our pains and sorrows. It treats us like straw dogs, substitute sacrificial objects. Here today, gone tomorrow. The universe doesn't care, baby. There's no crying in baseball. And the sage, the transcendent ruler who takes marching orders from heaven, is just as ruthless. So, one writer says, Taoism is all about living in harmony with the Tao, the natural flow of the universe. Now, the problem with this interpretation is that it doesn't fit the rest of the book, as we shall see very quickly, and next week in more detail. But Tao Te Ching chapter 5 does reflect some sayings both in the ancient Chinese writings and also even in the book of Psalms in the Bible, where the author cries out to heaven and says, "Where are you, God? Why are you ignoring me?" Chapter 7. Heaven and earth endure. This is because they do not live of or by themselves. Therefore, the sage puts himself last, yet comes out first. Is it not through lack of selfishness that he fulfills himself? Chapter 7 blatantly contradicts chapter 5. Heaven and earth last because they give of themselves. The sage accomplishes his goals by ignoring them, by putting himself behind. We'll talk more about this next week again, and we'll see that this is actually more typical of the Tao Te Ching than chapter 5. The closest Western parallel, again, is, I would say, to Jesus. The first shall be last. He who dies will live. He who loses his life will save it. This is one reason why the great Chinese writer Lin Yutang, whom I've already mentioned, after he lived a long life as what he called a pagan. In his old age, he wrote a book called From Paganism to Christianity, and he said, Jesus and Lao Zi are brothers. Chapter 8. The Tao is like water. This is by one of my students in Changsha, which says just that. He just thought this was a good traditional Chinese saying to give me. Highest good is like water. The virtue of water consists of it benefiting all things without striving, and in its occupying the low place which all men dislike. It thus resembles the Tao. Again, we have a picture of the Tao that is dramatically different from chapter 5. Tao is humble. True virtue does not consist of banging gongs and cymbals when it makes its offering at the temple. Neither does it pray, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like that sinner over there. Chapter 18. When the great way ceased to be observed, benevolence and righteousness came into vogue. Then appeared wisdom and shrewdness and great hypocrisy. When harmony no longer prevailed through the 6 kinships, filial sons appeared. When the states and clans fell into disorder, came loyal ministers. Here again, a lot of paradox in this chapter. What is this talking about? One thing you have to remember is when the Tao Te Ching was written, China was very competitive ideologically. We have the 100 schools, and probably the most famous of those schools was the Confucian school. So some people take this as a knock against the Confucianists, and in much Taoist literature, you see a lot of satire against the Confucianists. Lesser virtues which Confucius and his followers preached, filial piety, righteousness, wisdom, are a relapse from a higher, more holistic, less ostentatious virtue, which Lao Zi was seeking. And again, we see a little bit of connection here between Jesus and Lao Zi. Jesus also talked a lot about hypocrisy and saw, as the Old Testament puts it in the book of Psalms, all your good deeds are as worthless rags. But then we come to chapter 25. A very difficult chapter to fully understand, or I should say it's not so difficult to understand, but it's very easy to confuse. Understanding is not that hard, but misunderstanding it seems to be very easy. I'll give it in Chinese first. 人法地，地法天，天法道，道法自然. People take their way from the earth from heaven, heaven from the Tao, and the Tao from, some people say, from nature. That would fit in very well with chapter 5 again about the straw dogs. Heaven, the Tao arises from nature. It follows the order of nature. But in fact, the term 自然, while it means nature in modern Chinese, it is anachronistic to project it onto the Tao Te Ching itself. In the Tao Te Ching, the term is used 3 times, and it meant something more like self-producing or self-coming, self-existent. It's not contingent. The Tao apparently is of itself. That's probably the more common translation of this term. It almost certainly did not refer to nature or say that nature produced the Tao, because in fact we find in chapter 42 that the Tao produces all things. But what does it mean to produce? I'm going to put this off to next time to talk in more detail because it's very important. If the Tao is going to be connected or related or compared to God in some way, well, how did the Tao produce all things? According to chapter 42, the Tao gave birth to the One. Now, there's no difference between present and past tense in Chinese, either modern or ancient. The Tao gives birth to the One births the Two births the Three births all things. So here it appears that the Tao is actually before everything else. However, we have the word sheng, which is the regular word for giving birth in modern Chinese and in ancient Chinese. It's not the term for create, which is zao. So some people would ask, why do we use the word sheng here and not the word create if we're talking about Tao being a creator? Well, again, we're going to refer this mostly to next week, but I do want to point something out here, and that is that in this chapter, we see the Taoist idea of creation is kind of what you might call an evolutionary process. don't be frightened away by the word evolution here. The idea is basically that God sets the ball rolling, but much of his action comes through nature in some way. Then, in chapter 78, we come to one of the most striking passages in all of the Tao Te Ching. So the sage says, taking on oneself the reproach of the nation. This is being called Lord of the Sacrifice. To accept the nation's ill fortune is called becoming king under heaven. Straight language seems paradoxical. This is in dramatic contrast with chapter 5. Here the sage, who is a reflection of the Tao, the embodiment of the Tao on earth, accepts the sins of the nation upon himself and thus becomes the Lord of the Sacrifice. Finally, we have chapter 79. Remember, the Tao Te Ching has 81 chapters, so this is almost at the end. And it's a passage which we're also going to have to discuss in a little bit more detail later on, because it can be read in more than one way. We've talked about two different ways of interpreting the Tao Te Ching. One is the materialist way, in which the Tao is kind of pantheistic. The Tao is a picture of the universe. And in the other way of reading the Tao Te Ching, the Tao is conscious and is a willful being. This passage has been interpreted both ways. The way of heaven is impartial. It always sides on the. It is always on the side. The way of heaven is impartial. It is always on the side of the good person. I'm not going to explain that one this time. I think we've probably talked enough about this already, but I want to set it up for next week, in which we discuss how Christianity and the Taoist philosophy to one another. Before I go, though, I want to give you one little bit of a quiz, extra credit. Chapter 60. What does this mean? According to what you understand of the Tao Te Ching, governing a great state is like cooking a small fish. This has been Wind of the Tao podcast. We'll see you next week.